Thank you very much. So we're going to start listening to our presenters that I'm having a real problem skipping, decided what sentences in their bios to skip because they're so amazing. Each speaker will have 15, maximum 20 minutes. Our first speaker is Professor Jonathan Gressel. He's a professor emeritus at the Weizmann Institute for Sciences in Israel, the 2010 winner of the, or recipient of the Israel Prize in Agriculture. Professor Gressler is an internationally renowned expert on plant biotechnology and has carried out important studies in understanding the mechanisms that allow successful control of weeds and how weeds evolve resistance, on how to prevent gene flow, as well as on crop domestication. One of Professor Gressler's scientific solutions while at the Weizmann Institute is commercially applied for the control of the parasitic striga. Which weed? So without further ado, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me? When Donnie gave me the call and asked me to talk about ethics, I chose this title here, No More Hand-Me-Down Genes, Needed Good Seed, because without that we can't have good agriculture. The smallholder needs new solutions, and typically the smallholder who's doing the work is females much too often, and really the solutions have to be to make the smallholder a larger holder than they are, because it's really not conceivable to work this. Now, sometimes the men help, but not really. Oop. That's doesn't go backwards. Hey, what's wrong with this? There. Okay, the men sometimes, that's how the men help. Anyways, we need some new solutions. The advances have to come, especially for Africa and Southeast Asia, because they're huge land holdings with very, very low yields. And we have to look at why the yields are so low, and then we have to supply the answers if we want to solve the world's problems. And it's a huge market for the private sector, even though the private sector doesn't realize this, and they think that everything they should do for the third world should be philanthropic, but it actually should be for business reasons. Well, let's look at just simply at sub-Saharan Africa. Look at the maize yields. They're a third of the world's average. They bring down the world average. They're a sixth of the American yields. And there are two major reasons for this. One is called striga, witchweed, which we'll talk about, and the other is called stem borer, which we'll also talk about. This is striga, and next to it is a plant that's more common in the Middle East, broom rape. They look very pretty as flowers, but it isn't when you see a field full of them. This is a sorghum field. You can hardly see the sorghum. What you see is the witchweed. Same thing with maize, corn. It bewitches the corn turns yellow, the yields are very low. It's incredible what it does. Because actually it's a parasite, it germinates, goes towards the crop, and literally it sucks. I had some crazy ideas about how to deal with this many years ago, and we knew that industry had the material to deal with it. It took us a little while to get industry to give us the material to do some testings. This was done with colleagues of mine in the VAR. And because industry always said the developing world is not a market. We can't sell anything there. So they didn't want to give us the material. But actually, this is the first study we did with striga. It was published. Very rarely do weed papers get published in Nature. And we showed actually that one treatment with the herbicide on a crop, you'd spray the crop, and the herbicide would go through the crop into the roots and kill the attached striga. And you can see or in this case, broom rape. And you can see the huge differences in the size of the crop. One is treated, one isn't. Two different herbicides in this case. So the question came, how could this work for Africa? And when I talked about this with people from CIMMYT, they asked me how much the herbicide would cost. I told them, they said, forget about it. Can't do anything like that, too expensive. So I came up with a technology of treating the seeds with the herbicide instead of spraying the whole crop. Then you use 10 times less, but industry said that's totally uninteresting. We can't sell anything if it's 10 times. But their sales were zero. And the only way they could sell is if they sold 10 times less per hectare. And basically, CIMMYT did all the crossing of material from the U.S. It was non-transgenic in this case. They got the seed from the U.S. and crossed it and developed this. This is field trials with it. You can see the local hybrid covered with striga, and the material that we developed, or CIMMYT developed, they did all the work. I just did the talking. You can see the difference. Of course, this is an experiment station. You can ask me, what does it look like in a farmer's field? This is a farmer's field with a technology. And now the problem was to convince industry that 10 times less herbicide was worth selling. And only when we could convince BASF that they would only have to sell not to farmers, but to the seed companies that would apply the herbicide, then they could deal with it, and then they came on board a few years ago. Now, we do have to worry about the 4 crops are 80% of the calories for humans and their animals, and I wrote a book a few years ago about genetic glass ceilings, why there's so many crops that could be grown that aren't grown because they're not fully domesticated or they need new genes. Basically, they have a genetic glass ceiling, and only by bringing in new genes from the outside could we finish the development of some of these crops. Basically, we have to introduce new genes. Our only hope is genetic engineering. But industry only supplies hand-me-down genes, the genes that they've already used in the first world. And I said there were 2 problems in the maize. Solving one problem is never enough. Solving striga is not enough. You have to solve the problem of stem borers. So we have to get new genes for some of these things. Stem borer is the second major problem. There's a wonderful gene that controls the European stem borer, and that's a BT gene from one bacillus. But industry has thousands of BTs in their banks, different ones that control different insects. Now, they gave Africa the one that controls the European stem borer. Unfortunately, it doesn't control the African stem borer. So we have a situation with a hand-me-down gene that doesn't really work. And when industry was asked to supply other BTs for testing, they actually turned Africans down. And this is more than one. And there are other things that the developing world needs. A major problem in the developing world is seed storage for eating, because you have grain weevils and grain moths that attack the grain. They don't have controlled elevators like we have in the first world. They're sacks being controlled in stored in sheds, and by the end, a few months after you start storing, the material all looks like this. Not very good. Now, there are BT genes that should control these insects that could be put in the crops. We know that they're non-toxic to humans, but the genes aren't available. Another issue, kwashiorkor is one of the causes for kwashiorkor is aflatoxin in grain. Aflatoxin affects the liver. If the liver isn't working, you can feed a child 1,000 calories, and the child will only get the equivalent of 200 because the liver is non-functional. So there are genes. Industry has patents on genes for degrading aflatoxin, but they can't see where there was a profit, so they did not release them. Similar thing, fumonisins are another mycotoxin that's very common in the developing world. Tropical countries love these, where you have wet climates. These cause neural tube defects in babies, esophageal cancer in adults, and this is caused by a fusarium. There are genes that could give you resistance to fusarium. There are also genes that industry has patented that degrade fumonisins, but they are unavailable at present to the developing world. Very important for women in the developing world is infant formula when they don't have enough breast milk. It has to be soy milk because cow's milk is too expensive. The only problem is 1/3 of infants are allergic to soy, and those infants get diarrhea and die. Now, so what and people at the USDA in the United States already have made, using antisense technology, soy that does not have the allergens. And I'm waiting to see Similac someday with a label saying, contains only transgenic, non-allergenic soybean milk, contains no allergenic soybeans, good for infants of all ages. Now, another problem that we have is good seed. And there's a mantra that goes around a lot of people who know nothing about agriculture, like many NGOs, many activists, or some people call them whacktivists, people who are anti-private sector, and some well-meaning people who don't know anything about agriculture. And this mantra that you hear over and over and over is farmer saved seed, as if it was a holy item. And actually, farmer saved seed is about the worst thing you can give to farmers, especially farmers who don't know how to save seeds, especially in tropical countries. The leading person in this mantra is an ex-guru who is part of the Maharishi Foundation called Jeffrey Smith. And the Bible they use is his book, Seeds of Deception. Before he wrote this book, he was a flying yogurt, doing levitation, and he was a teacher of swing dancing. This is his total expertise. Yeah, I'll be done in 2 minutes. This is his total expertise in this area. Now, the difference between the two is good certified seed is correctly dried, so it can be stored well. It's weed, pathogen, and insect-free. It's treated with insecticides and fungicides usually, has a high germination, uniform stand, quickly gets out there and suppresses weeds, high yield. Farmer saved seed is typically poorly dried, low viability, low vitality. There was a study done in Nigeria a few years ago. Farmer to farmer sold seed in the markets, not certified seed. 20 to 80% of it in different years had striga seeds attached to the maize seed. In other words, the farmers dried their maize on the ground, picked up striga seed, so they were actually spreading striga from farm to farm in farmer to farmer seed instead of good seed. And typically, the longer you store the seed, the more years you keep doing farmer saved seed, you get poorer stands, non-uniform stands, and contaminated, as we talked about, and the yield lowers. It gets worse year after year. Now, the same people who promote, especially European NGOs who are yelling about we need farmer saved seed, know full well that in Europe, if a farmer saves seed, he has to pay royalties to the seed company that owns the intellectual property. But they want this free in Africa, that farmers should be growing the same seed over and over again. And even the European farmers, what they typically do is buy a small amount of seed, which they propagate, certified seed, and they use it 1 year. And every year they use new material. So it's not really saved year after year. It's usually 1 year from certified seed. Now, another example of an ethical issue is the private sector actually helped develop this golden rice philanthropically. And it could have saved millions of children from blindness, but getting this product out has been a major problem. It's been around for quite a while, and it's not in the hands of people. This could prevent so many people from being blind in the developing world. It's incredible, and the arguments against it are really non-valid. And what really is worse, you have people like Greenpeace going up, and this is Greenpeace burning a field of golden rice in the Philippines. Now, this picture actually looks very similar to this picture. And, or burning books, to my mind. So if we want to go to our roots here in Israel, you shall beat your swords into plows. Genetic engineering is one of the most powerful swords we have that could be used in agriculture, and we should be thinking about using it more often. The private sector has to decide whether to use biotech and health or lose potential market. And they must stand up to the whacktivists who are really much against it. Food security requires these new genes, requires new genetic material. Food security requires good seed in the hand of farmers. My favorite philosopher, James Thurber, said, "A word to the wise is not sufficient if it makes no sense." I hope I've made some sense to you today. Thank you very much.